Okay, we are live.
Okay.
Estelle, if you are there, you are welcome to get started.
I think we lost Beatrice.
Thank you, Bethany. I want to apologize again for this morning.
Oh, it happens. No worries at all.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Estelle.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us, and sorry for the delay. Are we already live? Alana?
We are live. Estelle, you should be able to share your screen and you're ready to get started.
Okay. Should I put on my video?
That's up to you.
Let me just. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay. I'm not sure if I should introduce myself or how exactly would it go.
Yes, sorry, just to briefly introduce Estelle, thank you so much for joining us for the Malagasy Scientist Seminar Series. We're very excited to hear your talk, and without further delay, we're looking forward to hearing about your perspectives on paleoecology, understanding the history and depth, real deep time history of Madagascar and how that can inform what we should be doing in the future. So take it away.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, James, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this Malagasy lecture series. And so as James already said, I'm a paleoecologist, more on the applied side, and I work on the timescale of the late Holocene, which is about 4,000 years ago up to present time. So my presentation today is going to be like an introduction on showing how relevant is paleoecology or knowing landscape history to conservation, and using the case for us in Madagascar. So my background basically is ecology and botany from the University of Antananarivo, where I did my undergrad, and then I finished my PhD in 2019 at the University of Cape Town. And currently, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow still at UCT in South Africa. I'm interested in how ecosystem works and what are the different disturbances, drivers of change. And this includes as well, we as humans, how do we interact with the environment, the ecosystem that's surrounding us? How could we benefit from it? And how could we manage better these ecosystems? And this through thinking on the different ecosystem services that can be used to ultimately think about the conservation of these areas and management. So you might hear from my talk some interest related to ecosystem dynamics. Then I'm interested also in fire ecology, human land use, but also climate change, on how the different ecosystems would respond to future changes of climate, and of course conservation. And this, I think, could be more integrated through an interdisciplinary approach. So in paleoecology or using long-term data, there are different steps, and there are also different materials that can be used to reconstruct past environment. And so like the first step we usually do is collect and select the materials that we use. But for today, my talk is going to focus on sediment cores, where we then extract samples, for example, pollen, microscopic charcoal, or also some coprophilous spores or dung spores, and also isotopes, some elemental proxies that we can use to reconstruct past environment. After that, we proceed to the analysis, and one of the analyses that's important related to paleoecology is the chronology, because you need to get that properly done, because before you can infer to what was the changes in the past and what drivers exactly have worked with it. And so once we have a good chronology, we proceed to the data analysis, and then the interpretation is with comparison with other different sources of knowledge, including like neo-ecological data sets, for example, or even social and traditional knowledge. And as an the paleoecology, being an applied paleoecologist, I usually focus on what is the current challenges and how we could solve those. And one example of this is looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. So that being said, we look at how we could take those records from the past and then interpret them and think about scenarios for the future. And as I mentioned, my work focused on the last 4,000, 2,000 years ago, and then see how the ecosystems has changed, how humans have affected the landscape, how climate have changed over time. So some of the work that could be investigated in paleoecology is, of course, vegetation cover. Like, how was the vegetation cover in a given areas? And this could help us as well assess the biodiversity changes through, for example, taxa turnover, and evaluate the different drivers of change, for example, fire, herbivory activities, and climate change, and of course, land use change on how people have shifted their use of lands over time. So in the case of Madagascar, I'm sure all of us are aware of the extinction events that occurred in the island at about 1,000 years ago. And this is subject of debates, whether it was caused by human or climate, and what happened within the environment where these megafaunas have lived. But then there is also the debate around the vegetation cover. Like when we compare, for example, what's happening in the central island Madagascar, we were thought that Madagascar was a green island covered by forest before human arrival. But the question that we ask ourselves is, what was that always the case? Were we always covered by forest, or what happened to the central island where we see now these open landscape, large open landscape in the area? And then, of course, in terms of the drivers, what were the different drivers? I mentioned a bit about humans. I mentioned about changes in climate, but then there is also the fire. How has fire changed within the different ecosystems in Madagascar landscape? Was it, are there natural fires? Was it affected only through human activities, or how exactly it has changed over time? So I will take a few case studies showing the application of this of paleoecology in trying to respond to such questions. The first two sites that I'm going to talk about are a site in southwest Madagascar, One is Lungis in the north, and then Andulunumbi in the south. So the region in southwestern Madagascar, based on a paleoclimate record that we reconstructed, is that the region is experiencing drying over time, and there's an increased evidence of drought. As you can see with this graph, the yellow part indicate drought or lesser rainfall compared to the wetter conditions at the top. With the blue part. So we found that there is like more recurrent and more pronounced drought event within the area, particularly in the last 700 years. So using this site, we wanted to know how was the vegetation in the last 2000 years within those two sites, and what are the drivers of change over time as well, and what would be the implication of such funding to the conservation of the ecosystems surrounding those two sites. So we, the standard methodologies that we use for paleoecology usually is that we go into the field, we collect samples from lake or ponds or marshes, and then we collect sediment cores such as this one, which we can then conduct radiocarbon dating. And through that, we would be able to assign the top of the core, which means at the top of the lake is the youngest or the near present time, and at the bottom is more like the oldest period. And then we look at different proxies, and in this case, in my talk today, I'm gonna introduce a bit about pollen. We used pollen, where that has been used as a proxy for the vegetation. We used also carbon isotopes to differentiate between the abundance of C3 and C4 plants. And then we used charcoal, microscopic charcoal, which are used for an indicator of fire, and dung spores, which could inform us about herbivory activities. And so going straight into Lungis, we had a diagram which is quite complicated to understand, but basically what we found was that there was a mosaic landscape within the area with presence of dry forest, and then also some xerophytics or dry adapted taxa, and some riparian trees that we found, in addition to changes in grass and herbaceous. And we combined those with like the charcoal record and spore records, which indicate fire, herbivory, and also the available rainfall records, and that's for the region. And to make it clearer, what we found is that there were three major changes in the vegetation. So at first, we found a mosaic of dry forest vegetation with Podocarpus mertesi, riparian forest, and then it changed into a more open ecosystems with a mosaic of dry forest and pandanus, and it became more open with pioneer taxa and xerophytics. And what we found was that during the different period, related to the arrival of pastoralism, there was changes in the vegetation rapid transition, and there is an increase in fire as well over time. In terms of drivers, we found that prior to 1000 AD, the vegetation has been responding to the variability of climate. And then after that, once pastoralism has occurred with the increase in fire that had led with the opening of the ecosystem, but this was followed with a drought event, which then has maintained the vegetation open. And at the near present period, we identified that both the effect of climate and also human land use linked to agropastoralism has been affecting the vegetation. In the site in Andulunumb, the site, the core we obtained here was about 7,000 years, but then there was a hiatus between this time. So related to the topic on how was the vegetation in the last 2000 years, we basically found that the vegetation has changed from 3 times change, but in the last 2000 years, a xerophytic bush and palm pandanus savanna. And then it became species poor with less taxa. And in terms of drivers, as you can see in here, the vegetation has been responding to climate in the last 7,000 years minus the hiatus until 700 calibrated years PP. And after that, it was mostly affected by agro-pastoralism activities with the increase in fire. And then when we look, just for example, at the rate of xerophytic, as we know how the spiny thickets is dominated by dry-adapted taxa, we found that for the site at Lungis in the north, in the near present period, there is this slight increase in xerophytics, while in the south at Andulunum, there is a decrease in abundance of xerophytic. And this coincided with the fact that there is an increase in drying in the north, and that has allowed these xerophytic taxa to become quite abundant. But compared to that, in the more southern side, this has been hindered by increasing activities linked to agropastoralism, and so even the xerophytic taxa became reduced, again confirming the species poor ecosystem. So linked to that, what does that mean in terms of management? So for Lungis, as we have seen, the impact at the near present period was a combination of human and climate. And this means that we need to improve the resilience of the ecosystem to climate, and also reduce the risk of losing the different taxa that exist within the area through human activities. And this means the management need to focus on land use, but also on prioritizing the heterogeneity of the landscape, as we have mentioned, that it has a mosaic landscape. And so that could help in the management of these ecosystems. On the other hand, when we looked at Andulunum, we saw that it's mostly affected by the increase in fire activities and human within the area, and that is seen through and that has led to the loss of taxa, even the dry-adapted taxa. And this requires some kind of management of the functional taxa of this area, but also in trying to prevent clearing and burning of the spiny thickets. So after looking about those drivers, I go back again a bit on the vegetation cover, which I mentioned about the contrast between the other regions, particularly, for example, the eastern region and the central islands, with the abundance of grasslands within the central islands of Madagascar. There was a study by one of our colleagues in our lab who did some sediment coring within the central islands of Madagascar, looking at how was the vegetation cover before and after human, was those grassland the results of human activities or not, and was fire also the results of human activities, as we have seen within the southwest region. And what he found was that first, he found that there was like more open ecosystems that were associated within those regions. So it was like a more mosaic with presence, of course, forest taxa, but then he found also an abundance of grass, for example, at about 6,000 years ago, as you can see in here. And also some ericoid shrubland taxa that has always been abundant within these areas. Another thing that he found as well is the abundance, the high influx of fire that occurred at about 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And that's based on record of human activities, which is about 2,000 years ago, human settlements. That is before human settlement. So based on that result, he found that the Central Highlands was not as forested as we thought, but with presence of open ecosystems, and then that there were natural fires. So what does those mean? Those means that we need to think about how we manage the fire in these areas and how we manage those open ecosystems. How could we think about reforestation within these areas? And of course, we cannot, it's not one size fits all. We have to think about the different context where we conduct these activities, but this provides us an insight of how things could be or have been in the past and how we could implement them with current management. So yes, paleoecology can help a bit in solving those challenges and those debate, and help in terms of finding management strategies, but it requires as well like long-term monitoring and the understanding of not only the ecological drivers or changes, but also including the social part. And this where I think is the need of an increased interdisciplinary investigations and increased collaboration between different center labs. And this will help us to think about how to establish a locally based approach that would be sustainable, not only for the biodiversity conservation, but also for the people that live within those areas. So here is like the papers that I mentioned in the talk, and I will try to end in there. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. Thank you. Hello?
Thank you so much, Estelle. That was fantastic. I don't have any questions in the chat right now. Beatrice, do you have any over there with you?
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I have one question. So right now, a crisis of forests are burning here in Madagascar. So what consequences should we expect in the future with these problems of the burning, the forests, acres of forests are burning in the south of Madagascar and in the center of Madagascar right now. So what consequences should we accept in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad now hearing the fire that's happening all over the place and seeing how it happens. So as I mentioned in my talk, so there are like different sources of fire within like the different ecosystem types. Although some of the fires that's happening now might be man-made, it will affect the different ecosystems differently. So I would say we cannot, I would not be able to say how exactly it would affect all the ecosystems in Madagascar. I would say we need to take one by one, what type of ecosystems do we have and what would be the effect of that in the future. So if we think like, for example, in an area that's for example, if we take the case of the grasslands, where sylavstasis was done, we saw that there is like presence of fire before human arrival within that site, and it has helped in maintaining the grasslands area. So in that case, we might think that even though there is this fire now, it might not affect that much the vegetation, because the vegetation has been driven through the changes of fire in the past. And this would not be the case for sites that's in the southwest or in the east, for example. So we need to consider these site by site before saying what to do. And of course, we need to consider as well the different stakeholders that works within the fire and conservation communities before thinking properly on what the consequences and what we could do to irremediate to these future consequences. Does that reply to your questions? You're muted, Beatrice.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll give it another moment or two over here. So if there's anyone watching who has any last questions for Estelle, go ahead and put them in the chat. I do have one personal question, Estelle. What got you interested in the paleoecology?
So as I mentioned, I'm an ecologist by training. But then I think some of the processes in terms of natural variability, you cannot really understand it through ecological scale, like looking at, for example, 5-year time period or 10-year time period. So there are some changes that occurs at a more longer time scale, on a centennial time scale, or others at millennial time scale. So I was kind of like intrigued on how we could think about those and what exactly, like just like thinking about being raised in Madagascar and thinking about, yes, we humans have participated or contributed to the changes in the landscape around us, but was this always the case? How exactly we could, is this always the drivers of change? Should we always think about blaming people, or is there like some scenarios where we could think of other drivers, and also how we could conciliate the different drivers in terms of management, and also on how we could try to include communities as part of the conservation arena. And so kind of like all of those mixture, not sure if that's clear enough, but all of those mixture kind of like motivated me in continuing in paleoecology and see exactly like how were the processes linked to landscape history and landscape change in Madagascar particularly. And and is there a way for us to think about that management, co-management, or management with communities, and think about future changes linked to climate and all of those.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Beatrice, do you have any last questions over in Madagascar?
No. I think it's okay for us. Thank you also for your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and end our live stream.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.